very welcome, all of you, to this afternoon session. My name is Svante. I used to be the chair of the ISDP board, and now I'm very loosely associated with ISDP as senior fellow, stressing the senior rather than the fellow. I won't go into the details of today's session, just want to show, as you've seen it already, that it is the occasion of publishing of a new paper by Svante Cornell and Frederick Starr in Washington. And we also have the pleasure of having a local expert, Mr. Saltybayev, sorry about the pronunciation, who is director of the Institute of World Economics and Politics in the Republic of Kazakhstan. But before I give the word to Svante Cornell, I would like to invite the Swedish ambassador to some of the countries in the region, namely Kashmir, to say a few words. Or maybe you would like to do it afterwards.
No, I can do it now. Could I use your mic?
Sure.
Thank you so much for that opportunity. My name is Ingrid Persman, and I am the Swedish ambassador to the 3 southern Central Asian countries, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan, and also to Azerbaijan. And I've had this post for a few years now, and I have to say that I'm extraordinarily fortunate to be able to see the changes, the positive changes that are now happening in Central Asia. I've said often over the last couple of years that it's very, very rare in a diplomat's career that you see big countries making sea changes, where there's a strong political will to change their own internal processes, to modernize the economy and to improve relations with the neighbors, and also look at neighbors that are going through tremendous challenges, such as Afghanistan in this case, and want to be truly a contributing factor. So in the last 2 years, a lot has changed in Central Asia, and much, much more is to come. I'm convinced of that. And I believe that the paper that Dr. Cornell and Dr. Starr have written on the emerging regional cooperation in Central Asia is going to be a piece that we all will remember a few years from now, when much more has been happening in the region. And I believe that we, coming from the Nordic countries, having gone through many, many years of cooperation, integration for our parts, we can share some of our experience, and I think more the practical cooperation that we have achieved between our 5 countries in the very north. Because I believe at this point in time, our friends in Central Asia are looking to neighbors, regions, to sub-regions to see what they can learn from how one can cooperate better together in a regional context. And I hope that we all, not only through this very good paper, but also through the work that we can do as diplomats, can share that when our views are asked for. So I'm very much looking forward to the discussion here today, and I'm looking forward to more papers and more research on what is happening in Central Asia. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Svante, would you like to start?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Svensson, and Mr. Svensson alluded to his attempts to be loosely affiliated, but it's not possible, unfortunately, if you are. ISDP is like the KGB. There is no such thing as a former ISDP person, as Mr. Svensson is experiencing. I would like, first of all, to say that I'm very happy that Mr. Saltybayev is here, who represents truly one of the most important think tanks in Central Asia and the region, and which is very directly involved in the production of ideas that is guiding both domestic and especially foreign policy of Kazakhstan. So I'm also looking forward to his perspective in our discussion. I will try to briefly outline or summarize our paper, which we began work on earlier this year against the background of exactly what Ambassador Persman mentioned, the very rapidly changing situation in Central Asia. And I think it's not an understatement to say that over the past 25 years, there's been very limited enthusiasm for Central Asia and Europe, and particularly in Sweden. I guess in Sweden, the region is really only mainly known through the activities of some of the Swedish large corporations in the region, more or less, and is generally viewed as something in a dark area far away with a lot of corruption and so on. And there is very little nuance to that picture, unfortunately. And I think that hasn't really changed very much in the past 27, 28 years since independence. We have one embassy ambassador, Yerzhan is here, from Central Asia, from Kazakhstan, who is working very assertively to help change this picture. But he's doing it alone, I think, at this moment in time, but very successfully to do it alone. But the thing is that and when things therefore change quickly, perceptions are slow to follow. And I think both in regards to what's happening in Kazakhstan, in Uzbekistan, more dramatically in the past 2 years, but also in terms of Central Asian countries and how they relate to each other, there is this idea of Central Asia as a hopeless region where countries don't cooperate, where the leaders don't like each other, and where there is really very little you can achieve. I think that has not necessarily always been true. And it definitely is not true today. There's a dramatically different reality which our perceptions have not followed with. Now, it is true that there are many problems and have been problems. Central Asia is a region where countries that have not tended to trade very much with each other. It has been called one of the least integrated world regions, and that is true, and there are reasons for this. But that said, I would say that in Central Asia, what we have been witnessing over the past quarter century is the emergence of statehood. And it is difficult to focus on cooperation before you have a state. You can't really build a second story of a house before you have the first story. And we have mistaken sometimes this lack of willingness to cooperate with a focus on sovereignty and a focus on building state institutions that, of course, did not exist only 25 years ago. And if you look at an alternative version, if you will, of the recent history of Central Asia, I think it can be contrasted quite favorably to some other regions of the world. We haven't had any interstate conflict in Central Asia, in spite of the fact that the borders between the countries were not really delineated at independence. There were ethnic minorities on one side of the border that, so to speak, belonged to another nation. But there was never any real risk even of interstate confrontation between them. The most blatant example of this is in 2010, when there were ethnic riots in the southern parts of Kyrgyzstan that directly targeted the Uzbek minority, and Uzbekistan's government decided very early on not to intervene in any way in this internal matter of Kyrgyzstan, for example. In fact, I would say that the relations between the countries have been quite peaceful and cordial. There have been disagreements. Tajikistan and Uzbekistan is perhaps the most obvious example. But they were mainly focused on their own affairs and building their own states. But if you look back also to the history of regionalism, there is a history of regionalism in Central Asia, a recent one, but it also goes back further. I won't even go back to ancient history, of course, before the existence of the 5 states. We can talk a lot about that. But my colleague, Frederick Starr, who participated in writing this paper, frequently makes the point that there is this, very often a division line is drawn between the nomadic and the sedentary cultures of Central Asia, whereas in fact the relationships between the nomads and the sedentary people were always very tight because they both needed each other. They were dependent on each other for survival, and there was much more cooperation than there was confrontation between them. But jumping many hundreds of years, I think it's important to note that the embryo, if you will, of the present day relationship between Central Asian states goes back to the Brezhnev era, where there was actually an informal, of course, but nevertheless an advanced form of consultation among all the 5 Central Asian leaders. Professor Starr interviewed the former Kyrgyz Soviet leader, Mr. Usubaliyev, about this, and he talked in detail about how the Central Asian leaders would coordinate with each other and have a joint position towards Moscow, and not let the Soviet Central Authority play them out against each other, but form a united bloc that left Moscow with basically no choice but to, so to speak, negotiate with the Central Asian states as a single unit. As I said, of course, the Central Asian states focused on sovereignty building and their own affairs for the next 25 years. However, already in 1993, first efforts to outline a new region was made, when the 5 leaders gathered and decided that to rename the region, because there was no such thing as a Central Asia in Soviet terminology. It was known as Middle Asia and Kazakhstan. So Kazakhstan was somehow part of, but still not part of this region, and it was called Middle Asia, which had connotations that are particular in the Russian language. And the Central Asian states decided to rename the region to Centralная Asia, Central Asia, and that Kazakhstan was a fully incorporated part of this region. That says something already about the common idea of the region that the 5 states have. There have also been other achievements. For example, the 5 states agreed on something very difficult, to declare, and Ambassador Yelokino knows a lot about this, to declare the region a nuclear weapons-free zone. It took many years of work, and it was against the opposition of all the nuclear powers, both the Russians and the Americans, the Chinese, but they managed to do it and to have that enshrined in the United Nations. That took a lot of cooperation. Of course, there were efforts to build region-wide institutions, mainly by 4 states. Turkmenistan has tended to stay away from all forms of regional cooperative structures, but they, from 1994 onwards, began to build what was first called the Central Asia Union, later the Central Asia Cooperation Organization, which was built around the tandem of the Uzbek-Kazakh partnership, which I'll come back to, and our report does in detail. That this is the end, and I think Mr. Saltybayev mentioned that in an earlier meeting today, that the core of Central Asian cooperation has to be the relationship between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, which has agenda-setting power, if you will, for the entire region. Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan also joined this structure. Now, it's often seen as some kind of parenthesis. The Central Asia Cooperation Organization ceased to exist in 2005, and there are reasons for that. There were weaknesses. I already mentioned the focus on sovereignty rather than on cooperation. There was a tendency among some states, particularly Uzbekistan, to be very defensive against challenges to security, which led them to sharpen their internal boundaries within Central Asia rather than to facilitate the opening of borders. There was also a tendency of economies in the region to be driven by resources, which does not require cooperation along borders, and in fact may inhibit cooperation across borders. But more importantly, I think, was the competition between Central Asian cooperation and Eurasian integration. Now, I mentioned specifically cooperation because the Central Asian states do not have an ambition to build a supranational structure. They have just acquired their sovereignty, they have built their independence, they're not willing to give away their independence, but what they want is to be able to coordinate and cooperate with each other. Eurasian integration is slightly different, especially, and we should note that the President of Kazakhstan, Mr. Nazarbayev, was among the first the people to take the initiative for greater Eurasian cooperation, although he viewed it primarily as an economic project of cooperation, whereas in Moscow it increasingly grew into a political project, and I think that's a very distinct views on Eurasian cooperation. The point for our purposes is that especially after 2001 and the growing American intervention into Central Asia for military purposes in Afghanistan, and with the color revolutions in 2003, 4, and 5 in first Georgia, Ukraine, and then Kyrgyzstan, there was a growing geopolitical competition in Central Asia, which complicated very much the matters for Central Asian cooperation, and opened up the door for the Russian-led project of Eurasian integration to take over, if you will. To make a long story short, Mr. Putin first asked to join as an observer to the Central Asia Cooperation Organization, then suggested that Russia be made a full member, and after Russia was made a full member, after a few years, suggested that the organization simply be merged with the Eurasian Economic Commission, as it was known at the time, Eurasec. And after that took place, there was no longer any Central Asian cooperation that did not include external powers. And for 10 years, almost a decade after that, Central Asian leaders did not meet in the absence of foreign leaders. There was a meeting in 2009 that focused specifically on the RLC matter, but after that there was no meeting of Central Asian leaders where no foreign head of state was present. So what has changed? And I think several things have changed. The most obvious changes have been more subtle. The first change, I think, is that I alluded a lot to the issue, the focus on building sovereignty and state institutions. Well, that project has more or less been completed. These are now not only states on paper, as in many ways they were in the early 1990s, these are now very real states that have the ability to say no to great powers when they feel that that's in their national interest. They feel more secure about their statehood, about their borders, about their institutions, which enables them now to focus on cooperation and not just on their own internal affairs. And that is true across the region. The second element, I think, a very important element, is that the economics of the region have also changed. After 2014 and the collapse of the oil price, there was a realization that a diversification of the economy was a paramount issue for the future, especially for Kazakhstan, which was very highly dependent on natural resources. The same should be true for Turkmenistan. I don't know to what extent that has been internalized there, and in Uzbekistan as well, which is not a major oil producer, but nevertheless partly dependent on hydrocarbons. And if you need to diversify your economy, that means you have to modernize your economy, you have to engage in economic reforms. Well, Central Asia is also landlocked, which means that you cannot benefit from you cannot be the new Vietnam or the new Taiwan or the new, to produce goods for the world. That's not going to happen in Central Asia simply because of the geographic location. But also where is there a prospect for diversification of the economy is mainly in the issues of transport and trade, nevertheless, because at the beginning or the realization of a land route for transportation between Europe and Asia. And I think Mr. Saltybayev will talk more about connectivity between Europe and Asia in his remarks, so I won't go into the details of that. But I think, obviously, that means that diversification of the economy and economic reform now required a totally different character of cooperation between the Central Asian states and harmonization in their trade regimes, legal systems, and other factors. I would also say that there have been major changes in the two big states of Central Asia that facilitated what we're now seeing. Modernization in Kazakhstan, of course, began much earlier. We see already in 2008 how the Kazakh government announced a path to Europe. We have published papers previously that have talked in detail about this, and we could guide you to them if needed. And of course, this was accelerated after the collapse of the oil price in 2015. The government launched a 100-step program in order to build transparency and institutional effectiveness in the country. 2 years later, there was a constitutional reform package that weakened the power of the president, strengthened the powers of parliament, and which actually received quite positive consideration by the Council of Europe's Venice Commission. And I should note that this political development goes directly against the prevailing regional trend towards one-man rule, which we see being manifested in China, in Turkey, as well as in Russia. Kazakhstan is going the other way. And interestingly, so today is Uzbekistan, which was a very closed country with a strongly authoritarian government under President Karimov, and very defensive in all matters that were potentially relevant for national security, which meant basically everything. Over the past 2 years under President Mirziyoyev, there has been a quite remarkable reform process, which we have published other papers about. I won't go into the details here. But just to note that the mantra, if you will, for this process has been Mr. Mirziyoyev's assertion that it's the time where the people work for the government is over. It's now time for the government to work for the people. This was followed by a national development strategy that he announced immediately upon his election, a shake-up of the Ministry of Finance, judicial reforms, soon enough steps to make the currency convertible, big pushes for foreign investment, a public denouncing of the State Security Service, which the new president called a mad dog, or compared to mad dogs, and abolished basically the structure as well as the prosecutor's office. There's also been steps towards religious liberalization, but most importantly, in Uzbekistan there was a change of policy towards regional neighbors, not least the relationship with Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan had long been supportive of greater cooperation among Central Asian states, but had met with, at least until the late 1990s, lukewarm support and then sometimes outright hostility from Uzbekistan. And without Uzbekistan there, it's very difficult to achieve any form of regional cooperation, even in spite of the size of Kazakhstan's economy. But now for the first time it was possible, and the Uzbek leadership worked very quickly to normalize and improve relations with all of its neighbors, including the two smaller states, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, with which they had many unresolved issues. So on this basis, we saw a first meeting of Central Asian presidents taking place in Astana, in Kazakhstan, last March, and we are now witnessing the planning of a second summit, and at which it is being discussed to institutionalize somehow this cooperation and take it to new levels. In this prospect, or rather in this context, there has already been a lot of interest by Central Asians, particularly in the Ministries of Foreign Affairs in Astana and in Tashkent, on looking at other models of regional cooperation in the world. Not only looking back, so to speak, at where they left off matters in 2005, but at what has happened elsewhere in the world and what are the, you don't need to reinvent the wheel, so to speak. You can learn from the mistakes of others, and I think that's very much the spirit right now, and that's why in this study our contribution, so to speak, is to look at what are the lessons of a couple of examples of regional cooperation. We look in detail at the Visegrad Group, Mercosur, the Nordic cooperation, as well as ASEAN. ASEAN is the one that Central Asians most are focusing on, perhaps, but we looked at several of them, and I think we have several conclusions of that. The first, and it actually focuses mostly around institutions. Mr. Nazarbayev at the Astana Summit of Central Asian leaders in March mentioned the Visegrad Group as an example of the informal consultations of heads of state that's already happened. But I would say that Central Asia has already passed the level of cooperation of the Visegrad countries, simply because they are part of a supranational structure, the EU and NATO, which limits the realm for regional cooperation among the four states. That might seem obvious. That might also seem like a good trade-off. For the Visegrad states, I think they have concluded that it's worth it. It's worth having a weak institutionalized cooperation among the four Central European countries if the benefit is to have the strong benefits that come with NATO and EU membership. In Central Asia, of course, there is no similar institution that could bring that type of benefit to all countries of the region. There is no supranational structure into which Central Asia could be integrated that is not dominated by one or another foreign power. Which means that for Central Asian cooperation to be successful, it actually has to remain Central Asian. There has to be, Central Asian states can choose membership in many different organizations, but there is as yet a very big need for something specifically Central Asians where no foreign powers, be it Europeans, Americans, Chinese, Turks, Russians, or Iranians, or Indians, are part. Now, we also looked at several others, as I said. Mercosur was an early success story in the 1990s, particularly relevant for Central Asia in that it managed to very rapidly increase the level of intra-regional trade between countries, which is something very relevant, as I said, in a region where intra-regional trade is very limited, but now growing very fast. What Mercosur also shows is the importance of institutions. Because of the weakness of institutions and a focus only on economic affairs and attempt to stay away from political affairs, Mercosur remains weakly institutionalized and also has seen an ability, ironically perhaps, of domestic political concerns in its major states overriding, so to speak, the organization's purpose. I won't go into details, but we've seen over the past several years how shifts between right-wing and left-wing governments in Argentina and Brazil led to even changes in the organization's membership. Left-wing governments wanted to get rid of Paraguay, so Paraguay was suspended. They wanted Venezuela to be included, so Venezuela was included and Paraguay suspended, and then that changed, and now it's the opposite. And that's a result of domestic political shifts in these countries, and that can happen very easily if you have top-down structures that are weakly institutionalized. I think there's a definite lesson for Central Asia in that experience. But most important, of course, are the experiences of the Nordic Council and ASEAN. ASEAN, and we go, of course, into a lot of detail in the paper itself, but I just say that a Singaporean diplomat, Bilahari Kapsikan, recently mentioned at a conference that the Central Asian states have much more in common today than ASEAN countries have after 50 years of regional cooperation. And I think that's a very important statement. The ASEAN countries had very little in common with each other. They had no common language, no common religion, no common cultural background. They are islands, that sometimes helps, most of them at least. But they were highly successful in building a cooperative structure in a difficult region in the middle of the Cold War that succeeded in creating loyalty ties to primarily to each other. That is, that the Southeast Asian countries achieved a consensus that their primary affiliation was with each other rather than with any foreign power. And that is something that they have applied in their relationship with China today. China, for example, likes very much to discuss bilaterally with countries because if you're large, that's beneficial for you. But ASEAN has created a structure whereby they work in unison or compactly with each other and have dialogues with foreign powers as a group and not as individual states. And I think in that sense, that is also a good lesson for Central Asia, where of course not only Russia but China also are very real neighbors. I would say that the Nordic Council may be the one that has the most similarities with Central Asia, which might be surprising given the differences between Central Asia and the Nordic world, but the cultural, the commonalities in cultural, religious experience in the Nordic region very much mirrors that in Central Asia. We even have the same parallelity in a dominant linguistic tradition, Scandinavian languages here, Turkic languages there, with one big exception, Tajikistan in Central Asia, Finland in the Nordic region. And we also share a similarity in that countries have chosen very different strategies in approaching pan-regional, supranational, if you will, cooperative or integrated structures. Where Denmark's the only country that's member of both the EU and NATO, Norway and Iceland only members of NATO, and Sweden and Finland only members of the EU. And in spite of this, for more than 70 years, the Nordic countries have been able to build meaningful and quite developed structures of regional cooperation that have benefited their citizens and also enabled their governments to be, even if you're outside of NATO, you can learn something about what's going on in NATO through Nordic cooperation and vice versa with the EU for those that are not members there. And I think that has a very important lesson for Central Asia, where states similarly have chosen completely different paths, from Kazakhstan, which is integrated very strongly in the Eurasian integrated structures, Turkmenistan, which is integrated in nothing, and Uzbekistan similarly has chosen a very, a cautious approach to all of these structures. That's not and the Nordic region shows that that is not an impediment to regional cooperation. You can build your own forms of regional cooperation totally in spite of the fact that some are members of the WTO, some are not, some are in the Eurasian Union, some are not, and so forth. And it's true even in defense cooperation, where in the past decade, Nordic countries, in spite of their different security orientations, have developed increasingly strong ties in the defense and defense industry sector, even though there are humps in the road. To conclude, I'd just like to mention that there are numbers of questions, of course. We are in the emerging stages of this new regionalism in Central Asia. The obvious question is how to institutionalize it, because our conclusion very strongly from our study both of Central Asia and of other models is that the success of this cooperative structure will depend on institutions. We all know Central Asia is a very top-led region. The relationship between the presidents will be totally determining for what kind of regional cooperation there will be. However, it would be a mistake to let regional cooperation only be about the relationship between the presidents. The more it can be built into institutions, the more it can be diluted, not diluted, but developed so that bureaucracies far down into the bureaucratic structures work regionally and think regionally, the better it will be for the region, because after all, Central Asian states don't necessarily know each other very well. We very often, when we have meetings with Central Asians or are in Central Asia, one of the questions we always ask, how many of you have been to another Central Asian country? And if you do this in a classroom full of Uzbek or Kazakh students, especially in Uzbekistan or Turkmenistan, you will find that very, very few people have even visited one of the other Central Asian countries. Now, they've been to Dubai, they've been to Paris, they may even have been to New York, but they've not been to their neighboring country. They don't know very much about their neighboring countries. They don't have a lot of experts about their neighboring countries. But by developing this type of cooperative structures down into bureaucratic institutions like the Nordic Council has done in 11 or 12 different areas, you will have an ability to learn from each other and make sure that even if your presidents sometimes disagree with each other or have a bad relationship for a while, cooperation can continue under the surface while the high politics wait to fix themselves. So how much and how soon to institutionalize is one of the key questions. Obviously, as I mentioned, there are two large states in Central Asia. Kazakhstan, by far, economically the largest, larger than the rest of Central Asia combined in economic terms. And Uzbekistan, by population, almost, well, maybe larger than the rest of the other four countries combined. But we also need to take into account the interest of the smaller states, otherwise it would not be a regional cooperation. And that will not necessarily be easy. Third aspect, I think, will be how Afghanistan should be seen. Afghanistan is increasingly seen, as it always was in history, as a Central Asian country. Now, our structures don't always mirror that. If you look at the foreign ministry here, the World Bank, or most Western structures, Afghanistan is treated as something completely different than Central Asia. Central Asia is something that's together with Europe, with Russia. Afghanistan is somewhere in Asia. Bureaucratically speaking. That's a Soviet-era reality, but it's not the reality today. That's not the reality of the 21st century. And in Central Asia, and in our approaches to these regions, we have to see that Central Asia and Afghanistan are increasingly part of the same region. Whether Central Asians will want to include Afghanistan fully now or step by step will be a decision they will have to face. The Afghans are ready for it, and definitely the Central Asians are now looking at ways to help Afghanistan develop rather than simply keep it away from Central Asia as was policies previously. Obviously, final concern is how great power politics are to be managed, given that it's probably probable and likely that some of the large powers to the east and to the north particularly may be skeptical of the desirability of greater coordination and cooperation among Central Asian states. I don't think we have a lot to help with in that, because Central Asians have much more of a history of managing relationships between great powers. But where we can help, definitely, and where the European Union has a role, is especially as a new strategy for the region is being developed in Brussels, to work for ways in which the EU can support, encourage, and concretely provide advice and experience to inform the process of growing regional cooperation in Central Asia. With that, Mr. Chairman, I will stop and I will hand the floor back.
Thank you, Svante. I failed to mention one thing in my introduction. The Silk Road program at ISDP precedes the Belt and Road program. I don't know if they picked that up, but it's interesting to know that you were looking in that direction very early on. And we might get back to, you mentioned at the end, the elephant in the room. The big elephants, the elephants rather, China on the one hand, and certainly Russia. But we will get an opportunity to talk about that during the Q&As. Mr. Saltybayev?
Dear colleagues, dear ladies and gentlemen, I'm it's an honor for me to be present here and discuss with you the findings of this new report on modernization and regionalism in Central Asia. Oh, sorry.
Please continue.
Yeah, thank you. And exchange opinions in that regard. I would like to thank the authors of this report for this opportunity. In fact, the issues of deeper cooperation among Central Asian, 5 Central Asian countries is again on the radar screen of politicians, scholars, and experts, as well as ordinary people of these 5 countries. The changes that we have seen in the last few years allow us to discuss the perspectives of how the Central Asian countries could turn the region into one space. The main driver of renewed economic cooperation between the regional states, of course, is recent internal changes in Tashkent. Being from the region, we can clearly see that the opening up of Uzbekistan is positively impacting the overall situation in the region, especially in bordering countries with whom Uzbekistan has deep relations like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. Yet we also acknowledge that much needs to be done in order to talk about truly successful region-wide cooperation. What we observe today is just first steps, which are lasting almost 25 years. There are still barriers to be overcome. Once the Central Asian countries are able to solve the existing contradictions, the region has potential to play a truly important role in the Eurasian continent. Firstly, I would like to talk about a little bit on barriers to regional cooperation. So let me start by briefly outlining some of the barriers that have been negatively influenced the development of the regional cooperation in Central Asia since the early 90s. We regularly hear from our colleagues that Central Asia remains one of the least integrated regions in the world. In fact, we have landlocked countries, we have no exit to the sea, we have no seaports except maybe ports on the Caspian Sea, which is also a landlocked sea. And we have one, and the only country in the world which is double landlocked, which is Uzbekistan. So, indeed, in fact, we look at the level of economic and political cooperation between the 5 states, the overall picture has not been very promising. A variety of regional organizations existed in the 90s and 2000, as the authors of the present report demonstrate, brought little change in this regard. I would like to identify the factors that have prevented these states in the region from deeper economic and political cooperation. Those factors relate to both the internal and external regional context surrounding Central Asia. On the one hand, low level of regional cooperation can be explained by the problems intrinsic to the region. One of the most important factors that inhibited the level of regional interaction has been the political disagreements between the elites of the Central Asian countries. After the collapse of the USSR, many sensitive issues arose between the newly independent states of the region. The countries once lived under the same roof now had to think of their own interests that might contradict others. But this was a natural process from the historical point of view. A collapse of any bigger empire state normally leads to the struggle between newly emerged parts. One of the main points of contradiction hindering regional cooperation in Central Asia have been border issues, especially in the Kyrgyz, Tajik, and Uzbek triangle. Forget about it, because it's very, very complicated in terms of how borders were drawn in the 30s by Stalin. So it was done intentionally because Stalin's purpose was not to let the region become one united Turkestan republic, but rather to divide it and rule. So another is the issue of water between the countries of upper reaches, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, on the one hand, and those of lower reaches, the rest, I mean, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. Moreover, the personal relationship between some leaders of the regional states also needs to be mentioned. For example, the Rahmon and Karimov relationship, the Tajik and Uzbek leader, had long been negative, had a negative impact on the relationship between Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, respectively. On the other hand, scarcity of regional cooperation in Central Asia can be explained by the influence of external powers. One of the cases in mind, the authors of the presented report also mentioned, was the involvement of external powers in regional geopolitics. Obviously, it is easier for some of the external actors to secure the interests on the basis of bilateral relationship with each of the Central Asian countries. Therefore, not always external actors have been interested in the consolidation of the Central Asia as a single region. So the same logic that was in the 30s still here, and external actors don't like, generally speaking, the idea of the unified, united, strong Central Asia. Likewise, the growth of the threat of terrorism and religious extremism, as well as other transboundary threats, such as drug trafficking and international crime, also affected the development of cross-border relations. The possible spread of mentioned untraditional threat from one country to another, normally from southern part of the Central Asia to the northern part, lead to the tightening of border security, restricting the development of trade economic relations, etc. The illustrative example here is the case of Uzbekistan, obviously. I mean, Uzbekistan before the Yerzhan came to power. As you all know, the country significantly restricted cross-border relations with its other neighbors, including Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan, in the late 90s. And the reason for that was exactly the possible leakage of terrorist and extremist elements from other countries to Uzbekistan. Such a move from one of the two key countries of Central Asia is, of course, have negatively shaped the fate of regional cooperation for more than 15 years. In this regard, it seems symbolic that today's regional transformation in Central Asia has also started from Uzbekistan. Second point, the perspectives of cooperation. As mentioned, new perspectives of enhanced regional cooperation in Central Asia are emerging, and internal changes in Uzbekistan have been one of the main drivers of these process. As a result, we observe today an intensification of regional cooperation on many directions. Firstly, the most obvious change is the growth of trade economic relations in the region in the last few years. For example, the trade turnover between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan has doubled since 2015 and is expected to constitute more than 3 billion this year, and we have a goal of 5 billion by 2020. Similarly, we also see a boom in trade relations between Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. In January and May 2018, there was a 100% growth. Kyrgyz-Uzbek relations have increased, constitute almost 50% in trade turnover. Secondly, we're also witnessing the de-escalation of political tensions between the states of the region. The question of borders has moved from the dead point. Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan, as well as Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, have already started constructive discussions on disputed areas. The situation around the water issue is also showing a sign of positive development. The summit of leaders of the Central Asian countries in Astana in March 2018 is another telling example of improving regionalism. In other words, what we see here is a period of political thaw in the region of Central Asia. And thirdly, there is a clear understanding among the Central Asian states that the deepening of regional cooperation is a necessary component of countering against common security issues. That's why we also see the activation of regional cooperation on transboundary threats like drug trafficking, terrorism, extremism, etc. The high-level conference on Afghanistan, which was held in Tashkent in March 2018, illustrates that the Central Asian countries are seeking to take the fate of the region on their own hands and actively participate in the resolution of existing regional issues instead of waiting when external powers come and give a clue. Overall, the regionalism tendencies in Central Asia that we observe today are highly promising. All countries of the region are rhetorically and practically demonstrating readiness to continue this enhanced dialogue, regional dialogue. If this trend further continues, this will positively affect not only the states of the region, but also a wider regional surrounding Central Asia. I mean, the Western China, south of Russia, Caspian Sea, Middle East. So it would have a wider effect on Eurasia as a whole. So what does it give to wider region continent? What can the increase of regional cooperation in Central Asia provide for the Eurasia? The answer to this question is connectivity. Mr. Cornell and Mr. Starr in their today's report mentioned a very interesting point. When we say Central Asia, what is it central to? So this region is, quite frankly, peripheral to Europe, as well as peripheral to Asia. I mean, if we see as a central to Asia, the Asia-Pacific region, the Southeast Asia, which is the main economic center of Asia right now. So from this point, it's really unclear what Central Asia is central to. But today we cannot treat Europe and Asia totally separately from each other. Instead, the notion of Eurasia is becoming widely used, or Greater Eurasia. When we look from this aspect, we can say that Central Asia is central to Eurasia. The idea of connectivity between Europe and Asia has been gaining prominence in both political and academic circles for a while. On the one hand, China's Belt and Road Initiative aims to connect Asia with European market. This initiative has been implemented for 5 years and was actually declared during the visit of Mr. Xi Jinping to Astana in Nazarbayev University in September 2013. So it shows how important Kazakhstan actually for China in developing this whole BRI project. On the other hand, we see the same movement from the other part. In September this year, the European Union declared, it's not yet implemented, but it's in the process of drafting the strategy, the strategy for connectivity between Europe and Asia. It is already in place, right? So in other words, the movement is reciprocal. The growth of importance of connectivity between Europe and Asia increases the role of Central Asia as a transit region or transit hub. Any transit route between the two sides, I mean Europe and China, can hardly avoid passing passing through Central Asia, and in particular Kazakhstan as the biggest country of the region. As a result, the more consolidated and stable Central Asia region is, the more sustainable becomes the idea of connectivity between Asia and the Europe. In fact, the increase of economic relation, construction of new regional infrastructure, harmonization of regional trade economic policies, as well as standards among Central Asian countries, will significantly ease the fate of connectivity projects. The only way to achieve such a condition in the region is to further continue and deepen regional cooperation. Therefore, the development of regional cooperation in Central Asia is not only in interest of the regional countries, but also should be in the interest of external actors, including Europe. It is one of the few cases, I think, in international relations when the situation is totally win-win for all interested parties. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before I open up, yes. Before I open up for questions, I would like to, from the bottom of my ignorance, pose a question about the growing elephant in the wider region, Turkey. Does Turkey have any specific interests in influencing developments in this region?
Thank you. I think Turkey has traditionally, I think, been an interested party in Central Asia, but one that has had to reduce its ambitions, let's say, because for a variety of reasons. First, Turkey is quite far away. Its ability to project influence is also shown to be quite limited. And in any case, in the past decade, Turkey has oriented itself mainly towards the Middle East. And I think in Central Asia, people have been watching that reorientation of Turkey. and drawn their own conclusions. But beyond that, it seems that in recent times, because the reorientation to the Middle East didn't go so well, there has been a newfound interest in Central Asia. There is a Turkic Council that gathers several, mainly actually 4 countries, Turkey, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, where Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan do not take part, which has been, if you will, Turkey's vehicle for a format for discussions with Central Asia. It's not the highest. So let's put it this way: Turkey is not among the most influential players, but it's not one that creates trouble for regional cooperation either.
First of all, I think that Turkey is playing a very significant role with regard to the region from the 90s. Is playing this role still. As was rightfully said here, it is too distant from the region to have a direct influence or to be really influential power in terms of like military influence or geopolitical influence. Turkey is more like a cultural power within the region because of this connection, the cultural connection between the states of the Central Asia and Azerbaijan with Turkey. We're all Turkish-speaking countries. Of course, it depends which country you're talking about. If Azerbaijan is almost like it has the same language, but in case of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, we have a different Turkic family. Family of languages, so it's not so easy to understand Turkish language if you're like a Kazakh-speaking person. But still, Turkey is very important, and I think it has a positive impact in terms of balancing the regional, other regional and global powers within the Central Asia. Because without Turkey, it could be really hard. You have like Russia, China, United States, to serve as the European Union, which is not so much political power, but rather an economical one and a cultural one. And you have Iran, which is very close to Central Asia, which is a big power, in terms of regional power. We are bordering with Iran, through Caspian Sea. Tajikistan, Turkmenistan has a direct border immediate with Iran, and they have this, especially in the case of Tajikistan, which is a Farsi-speaking country, very strong cultural influence. So actually, for Central Asia, you need some external balancing power, whether it's Turkey or whether it's Japan or any other country, which will provide an alternative for the regional countries in terms of investments, in terms of all other aspects that is important for regional development. So I think that, yeah, to some extent, Turkey is a big player, elephant in the room, as you said, but it has more like, more or less positive impact on the regional development rather than, negative one.
Thank you, Rick. Yeah, thank you very much. Questions? Please identify yourself and tell us what your question.
Yeah, you can take this microphone, thank you.
There is one behind the window there.
Thank you for your presentations. My name is Anastasia Starchenko. I'm actually an intern at ISDP. My question, you have mentioned a low level of integration in Central Asia, largely due to institutional weakness when it comes to regional cooperation. So I would like to ask you about the Commonwealth of Independent States. I'm curious to hear about it as a Ukrainian, although Ukraine has never joined the membership officially, and especially after 2014. But my point is that CIS is quite a vague and broad framework with a strong connotation of the Russian leadership. So, but I also know that Kazakhstan presided in 2015. So my question is, does this framework still play any role de facto in regional cooperation? Or perhaps it is out of existence in reality? Thank you.
Thank you.
the lack of institutional structure in Central Asia.
Particularly in terms of CIS.
Okay. So actually, the Central Asia is, as any region, I should say, to some extent fractured one. So we had different types of institutions to which different countries have different connections or level of integration. So for example, Kazakhstan is a part and the active member of the Eurasian Economic Union. We also are part of the Common Security Treaty Organization with Russia and Belarus and Armenia and Kyrgyzstan. So in this sense, we are pretty much closely connected to Russia and to actually the strategic ally of Russia. And Russia has played an important role in providing security for the Kazakhstan and for the wider region of Central Asia. We have close economic connections, and due to these Eurasian Economic Union, we also ease these issues of taxation, tariffs, and other sort of regulations between our markets. So we open up Russian market to a certain extent for the Kazakhstani exporters, etc. So it's playing an important role for us, and a positive one. At the same time, Kazakhstan is part of other institutions like was mentioned before, like Turkey Council, which is more like a cultural organization, more driven by the cultural interests rather than political one. And we also are part of different other organizations such as, for example, OECD, etc. But they're not so much important in terms of real impact on the processes within the region. The problem is that we do not have any regional organization as such. I mean, the Central Asia. There were attempts in the 90s, but as it was rightfully mentioned, in the process of building up independent institutions and creating a statehood, it's not really easy to give up partly your independence to some subnational level, because it would be contradictory to this whole process of nation building. So, but right now, I think that Central Asian countries are quite mature and ready to give up partly the sovereignty to this subnational level. But it will be not a very short and easy process, because actually even the this year meeting of Central Asian leaders in Astana was not wrapped up as a summit or forum or etc. It was like working meeting of Central Asian countries on some working issues, etc. So we intentionally cooling it down. So we're not trying to portray it as some big integration or process of political integration, because firstly, for external powers, it will be not easy agenda, and to sell it to them would be not an easy option for us. Secondly, countries of Central Asia are not really ready to fully integrate at this stage, at least some of them, because Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan are more ready to cooperate and to work more closely, because we have economic relations, more or less interconnected markets, especially with regard to the regional markets in South Kazakhstan and northern Uzbekistan, because actually the Tashkent is just bordering with the South Kazakhstan region. So, and the cultural connections, of course, are very important. But some countries like Tajikistan, Turkmenistan are more or less isolated. So it will be not an integration, but cooperation on different levels and with different speed. But it will lead to a result, because just 5 years ago it wasn't possible. When the previous leadership of Uzbekistan was simply not ready to cooperate in any way. So today it is changing, and to very much extent because of the change in Tashkent. So we hope that this process will continue.
Let me just add on the issue of the CIS. I think the CIS, I mean the Commonwealth of Independent States, in a way played out its role. I think you can look at it in terms of, from the Russian perspective at least, in as a concentric circles, where the CIS is the biggest concentric circle. It's like, I suppose from the Western point of view, the OSCE is the biggest concentric circle where everybody is a member, and you get points for participating, so to speak. Council of Europe is more narrow, the EU and NATO even more narrow. The CIS was really created in order to negotiate the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And because it includes everybody, we soon saw from the middle of the 90s the creation of a group of countries that did not want the CIS to take up any form of integrationist approach, but that basically to regulate the divorce. And that was one group of countries in which, Georgia, Ukraine, Azerbaijan, and Moldova, which Uzbekistan was a part of for a while and then left. And I think that led Russia to focus mainly on other institutions for the CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, started off by being part of the CIS. But because countries like Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Uzbekistan refused to renew their membership, it was branched off into a separate organization. Later we saw, of course, the creation of the Eurasian Economic Community, the Eurasian Customs Union, and the Eurasian Economic Union. So I think these are the institutions that are fulfilling that role, which means that from the point of view of the major country, the dominant country, Russia, the CIS doesn't really play that same role anymore. In any case, Georgia and Ukraine have left the organization. Turkmenistan was always an observer rather than a full member. So there's really not that much left of it.
Thank you, Marianne.
Marianne Lanatsa.
Microphone is here.
Marianne Lanatsa, affiliated to Lund Stockholm University. And I would like to put a question. We are speaking about the elephants in the room, but we mentioned China, but not Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And since India and Pakistan became members, and also that so many meetings are to a certain extent overlapping the BRICS meeting, there have been even more focus on the organization and which role it can play as a part of the so-called developing countries, or at least not OECD countries outside. So that is my question about the role then within this. You mentioned earlier Visegrad countries, but if you look at Sweden and some other countries within the European Union, we are acting as like-minded countries. And there are such feeling developing among the countries in Central Asia, for example, vis-à-vis the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Thank you.
Regarding SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, it was created in Shanghai in 2005, I think. It was just an organization more or less focused on the border issues, like how to settle down these border issues with China, of all these countries that former parts of this former Soviet Union, right? So we resolved this issue, and then the question arose what we should do next. The organization becoming more and more involved in political and economical cooperation among all these states. And right now it is becoming even larger with the acceptance of India and Pakistan as a full members of the organization in Astana. I think it was like 2018 when they were fully accepted. So it's now an organization that covered more or less the most part of the Asia and has like about more than half of the population of the whole inferior Asia. So in this sense it's very important, and in this sense it really has impact and capacity to be influential. But in terms of how it's really influential, I'm not so sure, because actually all these parts of this SCO has different approaches, has different agendas, and different regions actually have different sort of alliances. For example, India are more involved in relations with the United States, whereas China, for example, is in trade war with the United States. Russia is balancing between like Cold War and sort of with the West, whereas Kazakhstan is trying to be neutral and positively interacting with everybody. So SCO is kind of, yes, it's a very important organization, but still it has not formed itself as some center of power, center of gravity in terms of like geopolitical will, etc., because it has so many different parts with it. Regarding the Nordic Council and how it could be or could not be the model for the Central Asia, I think you said that you're like-minded countries, so the same mentality, the same values, etc. I think that with regard to Central Asia, we also have this capacity to be a more unified region, because at least Turkic-speaking countries of the Central Asia are more or less interconnected in cultural sense, in historical sense, etc. We and Kyrgyz, we and Uzbeks, I mean, we Kazakhs have always been in deep, almost family connections, so many interethnic marriages, etc. So I think that in this sense we have the potential to become more integrated. We have a case of Tajikistan, which is a Farsi-speaking country, which is closer to Iran in this sense, not to Turkey, but still Tajikistan has this same post-Soviet experience, so they were part of the same sphere. Of course, they are less Russian-speaking right now. For example, with regards in comparison with Kazakhstan, for example, Kazakhstan is maybe the mostly Russian-speaking country still, because 99% of the population can speak almost fluent Russian, which is not the case for Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, which are less Russian-speaking, and there is a tendency of them shifting toward other cultural centers of influence. It's interesting, by the way, that, for example, in Tajikistan, the most popular language right now is Chinese, and Chinese language courses are almost in every village. So you have Chinese influence everywhere. In Tajikistan, which is, in all senses, could not be much different from China, because, for example, even from the point of view of the, how to say, the physiological archetype, they are pretty much different from even the neighboring ethnic groups like Kazakhs and Kyrgyz. So, but still, the influence of China is very much present in Tajikistan, and you can see it if you ever visit Tajikistan. It is a very complicated issue. I mean, how can we be united, and what could be this glue that could, stick us together? But at least some countries of the region, I would mention three: Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, have very much in common with each other, and I think we can create sort of the engine for the center of gravity for the integration of the whole region. Because for European Union, for example, you need France and Germany to find some common grounds, and then it became the center of gravity for the whole of Europe, and then European Union emerged. So, I mean, in the case of Central Asia, it will also be a very step-by-step process.
Let me just add very quickly that I think on the role of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in Central Asia, the way I look at it, is depends on the beholder. For the Central Asians, it's about organizing your relationship with Russia and China. For Russia, it's structuring your relationship with China in Central Asia, and for the Chinese, regulating the relationship with Russia in Central Asia. Now, the problem is that the perspective on what that relationship is very different. In Europe and the United States, there is a notion of some kind of Chinese-Russian alliance. I think nothing could be further from the truth. In Central Asia, depending on which country you are, I think there is increasingly a perspective of a strong rivalry between China and Russia. And they want to make sure that this rivalry is somehow negotiated and not ends up in some kind of anarchy. I can give you examples of how this has played out. In 2008, after the Russian invasion of Georgia, there was a very strong push by the Russian leadership for Central Asian states to recognize the independence of Abkhazia and South Ossetia as Russia had. Thanks to the Chinese, all the Central Asians at a Shanghai Cooperation Summit, I think in Dushanbe in 2008, right after in September, they all flocked to the Chinese, and the Chinese provided the cover that allowed the Central Asians to say no to the Russians, for example, 2 years later, 2010, the violence in southern Kyrgyzstan, when Russia was planning again to have a military intervention in Kyrgyzstan. It was at the SCO summit in Tashkent, right around that time, that again the Chinese, and especially the Chinese and the Uzbeks, jointly made a declaration that made sure that no foreign powers should get involved in internal affairs of Kyrgyzstan. So there are several examples of how China has played a role in, so to speak, for Central Asian states to help control a Russian reaction to a crisis. And I think in the future it might flip the other way. That for the Central Asians, in not so distant future, I think the main issue will not be negotiating the Russian relationship, but the Chinese relationship. And then Russia will be useful for them to try to regulate China's reaction to some form of regional.
Thank you, Svante. We got one there. Maybe we should, in the interest of time, we should collect a few questions. Would you like to start?
Of course. So following up, my name is Monica Doneta and I work with Global Youth Cooperation. And I found quite interested that you mentioned that there's a lack of youth, let's say, knowing about each other from the neighboring countries. And I also think from my perspective, since as a student I attend many conferences, and I noticed that in Russia in particular, this Central Asian countries have a special forum designed for them to discuss common issues, especially for youth. While my question is, what do you think what holds back the region's educational institutions to start this collaboration between universities, for example, cultural exchanges, because it looks like simple things, but it's strange that it does not happening, because this definitely would give much strength for the region itself to establish. Thank you.
Down there.
Mr. Ambassador. Let me thank, first of all, both presenters for very nice presentations, and also congratulate ISDP with the new book. And I have a question about the Organization of Economic Cooperation. You see, I served for some time in Tehran, and every Wednesday I spent a whole day at the headquarters of the Organization of Economic Cooperation, but I'm not sure if you, most of you know about that organization. It is, it includes 10 countries, 5 Central Asian, Azerbaijan, Turkey, Iran, Pakistan. It is this organization. I actually do not follow its activity for the recent years, but sometimes there was an impression that it is more or less dormant, although it is institutionally strongly organized. Every week meetings and discussions. Do you think that the ongoing development of cooperation in Central Asia will help to such organizations as OECD, Organization of Economic Cooperation, to be more active, more helpful, specifically for Central Asian countries themselves? Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe we should take one more.
Thank you very much. Genevieve Garnigo from Ireland. My question, just I would like to ask Mr. Khan about the role of Afghanistan. And you repeatedly mentioned in the report that Afghanistan should be considered as part of the Central Asia. But being from the region, I don't feel that there is a kind of openness to this idea, both among political elites as well as among ordinary people. How do you think, to what extent is this possible, having Afghanistan as an integrated part of this Central Asia? And this idea is, around here for almost a decade or even more. Thank you.
Should I start? Okay. Thank you. On the educational institutions, I think that's a very important question. I think for those who have visited educational institutions in the region, that makes it easier to see the answer. There are actually two categories, I would say, of educational institutions. Mr. Saltybayev would be able to speak to this, I think, which is that there are Soviet-era, unreformed educational institutions, and there are new and very dynamic ones, such as the Nazarbayev University, for example, in Kazakhstan. I think the old institutions will be extremely difficult to get into real. I mean, there might be, on paper, educational cooperation initiatives. I have a hard time seeing how, in any time soon, there will be real ones. The new institutions, however, I think is possible, but they are very new and they have been recently created. They have not matured fully. There are contacts already between the, for example, the ADA University in Baku. Now Tashkent is developing a law university on international standards. Nazarbayev University is, of course, the oldest and best example of this. And I think there are already contacts on the top level among these educational institutions. To what extent they are able to translate that into something else, we'll have to see. It's going to take time. The main obstacle, I think, is the educational institutions across this whole region happen to be almost textbook examples of post-Soviet, or not even post, I mean, still Soviet-era institutions in many ways where mismanagement, unfortunately a lot of corruption is taking place, so that makes it difficult. Ambassador, the ECO, I thought about it when we were talking earlier. We didn't mention it, and I think it's a long time since I heard somebody mention the ECO. I know that it actually has one very important factor which nobody thinks about, which you probably are aware of, which is that postage within you can send letters at the cost of domestic stamps. The problem, of course, is nobody sends a letter anymore. So the ECO's, the role in that field was. But joking aside, I think the ECO really never was able, I think, to get away from its original format, which was focused on the relationship between Turkey, Iran, and Pakistan, and particularly focused on the Iranian role as a driver of this organization, with Turkey really investing in Turkey cooperation rather than the ECO. And I think especially now that these countries are focused, especially Turkey and Iran, are focused on other issues. They're not focused in Central Asia, they have been focused on their confrontation or relationship in Syria and Iraq. And that, I think, is going to make it difficult for the ECO to find a role. And if Central Asia finds there's a plethora of organizations, everybody has one. The Turkey Council is Turkey's, the ECO. I mean, by a little bit of stretch, we can call it the Iranian organization for the region, and the SCO is China's. So the more Central Asians create their organization, that's going to limit the role for the peripheral ones, I think, like ECO. They might find a role at some point, but I think change in Iran will have to be probably necessary for that. Afghanistan, that's a very important question. The reason we pay so much attention to Afghanistan in the report is because we look at this in a long-term perspective. And Central Asia is located where it is. As Mr. Saltybayev mentioned, it's landlocked. And Uzbekistan still exports its cotton through the port of Riga. That doesn't really make sense. The logical, Shanghai isn't very much close to the Central Asia either. So the place that your access to the sea from Central Asia, your best bet actually for an access to the sea is Afghanistan. And historically, Afghanistan has been a Central Asian state. You see increasingly that Afghanistan is looking at itself as a Central Asian state, and Mr. Ghani under this government is much more active than it has been in the past. Now, we don't minimize the problems, we fully realize the difficulties, but I think what's changed in Central Asia, and we see this actually in all countries, but especially in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, is that Afghanistan is not just seen as an obstacle anymore. It's seen as a country where there are problems, but there are opportunities. And that it's incumbent upon the Central Asian states to take a role to help effectuate change and progress in Afghanistan itself. And I think in that sense, it becomes clearer if you take it from a longer term perspective. I mean, Central Asian cooperation of 5 states, that really follows still the Soviet definition of Central Asia. By the way, there's an even bigger elephant in the room, which is if you have Central Asian cooperation, how would you deal with Xinjiang? You know, that's a third Central Asia, is in China. It's been changed fundamentally. The biggest city in Central Asia is Urumqi, by far. And economically also, I mean, the second powerhouse beside Kazakhstan is Xinjiang. Anyways, now Xinjiang, as we know, has a lot of issues. I mean, there is a systematic re-education effort for all the non-Han population going on, and there are big brothers coming in, living with families and monitoring what they're. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on there. But this is a huge issue for the future of Central Asia. If we're going to talk about Central Asian cooperation, not now maybe, but 5, 10, 15 years down the road, it'll have to deal with Afghanistan, it'll also have to deal with Xinjiang. So, Xinjiang, by the way, there is an organization called, since we're listing all organizations, there's one called CARAC, which is a Asian Development Bank-driven initiative in which Xinjiang is a member, along with Mongolia and Central Asian states and a few others. So it has 11 members, I think, where the province of Xinjiang is a member of the organization. So there are ways in which you can deal with that. But I think going forward, I think it's very important to not get stuck with the Soviet definitions, because they were drawn in the 1920s. Now, we know, and the African Union is the same thing. Central Asia is the same. You know, you don't want to change borders, because if you open that box, you open a disaster. Which is, of course, why the Chinese and others were so alarmed by the Russian change of borders in Georgia, by the way. Because everybody realizes it can come to you tomorrow if it starts somewhere else. But the reality is that the Soviet boundaries of independent states, yes, they are there, and we have to respect them, because that's how the international system works. Maybe if we had drawn the borders today, I think nobody would have drawn the borders of Central Asian states exactly the way they are today. That's a reality which there's no point in talking about it. But if you look at how you define the region, just defining it in terms of the Soviet definition is just not relevant anymore. If you look at economic interactions increasingly, you know, Tajikistan is beginning very soon to export electricity through Afghanistan into Pakistan. This is, you know, nobody believed it would happen. It's going to happen. You see how the region is being woven together, and that's why the first one on the list which you have to deal with as you redefine mentally what Central Asia is has to be Afghanistan, because it holds the key to the future of the region, which is by determining whether Central Asia will continue to be landlocked or not.
There were several questions. So the first one is the cultural collaboration between the universities and the universities communities between each other. Yes, I would totally agree with this previous speaker that we have two types of universities actually in Central Asia. One is a state, mostly state-owned university, which are more like backwards and more conservative in that sense of these words, which are not ready to cooperate fully. And we have private universities which are more dynamic and more engaged in international cooperation. For example, in Almaty we have at least 3 universities, University of International Business, KIMAP, and the Kazakh British Technical University. And Nazarbayev University, obviously, in Astana is an example of real international cooperation. In Nazarbayev University they have several schools which are like common projects with leading US universities like Duke and Harvard and others. I totally agree that for the Central Asia to become a fully integrated region, you have this cultural people-to-people connection, and the universities are obviously these hotspots for these connectivities, because for transport routes you need these big logistical centers. For the people you need some different kind of spaces like universities, cultural centers, etc. For example, China is very proactive in this regard. They creating hundreds of Confucius centers around the world. We have 4 Confucius centers in Kazakhstan, and they would very much like the idea of Confucius center in every oblast, in every region of the Kazakhstan, but we are not so much ready for this so far. And at the same time, Russia has its own like cultural policy. They have Rossотрудничество, this Russian cooperation organization, which is mostly for the Russian-speaking communities in the post-Soviet space. So they're very proactive too. So in Central Asia, we need this sort of infrastructure of cultural relations between countries. And of course, because of the lack of economic opportunities, for example, in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, they had simply not enough resources for that. Kazakhstan could be a vital player in this regard. We can provide some financial support. We even help Afghanistan. We helping Afghani youth to be educated. We have about like 50 million USD program of education of Afghan youth in Kazakhstan. And hundreds of young people, girls and boys were educated in medicine and engineering, etc. in Kazakhstani universities. So, and they are now already working in Afghanistan and helping to rebuild this country. Regarding the OEC, actually I don't know this organization, but ECO, I'm sorry. As in the case of many organizations, in order to have an effective one, you need financial support, you need willingness of the participants to, and you have some common goal, which should be tangible, which you can really achieve, not something just for discussion. So I think that there are dozens of this kind of organizations in the post-Soviet space, in Eurasia, but not all of them are working well enough. I think that we have to focus on those organizations that already existed. I mean, the Turkey Council, the Eurasian Economic Union, and of course these new trends of cooperation in Central Asia shall be institutionalized too. And we have to have an organization on the regional level. I think it's totally possible right now because of the willingness of the political leaders in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, and will inevitably draw others to this process. The third one is Afghanistan as part of Central Asia. Actually, it's always a debate among the academic circles and among the political whether we should accept this American idea of Afghanistan as a Central Asia. Mostly it is rejected on the just level of just psychology, if you will. So because Afghanistan is so much different from the post-Soviet space. First of all, it's less educated. Secondly, it is different in terms of culture, because it's very tribalistic culture. It is very religious culture, which is so much different from the mostly secular states of the Central Asia, especially Kazakhstan. Pragmatically speaking, of course, Afghanistan is very important for us as an access to the South Asia, to India, to Pakistan, to Indian Ocean. And we understand it, but at the same time, we understand that the problems with Afghanistan are so high, so intense, that for now, to resolve them in the short-term future, or in 5 years, or even in 10 years, I don't see any real prospects for this. That's why Kazakhstan is proactive in creating infrastructure that is bypassing Afghanistan. We already have relations. We have port infrastructure in China. We lease a port in Langan. It's a port in the Yellow Sea. We have facilities with Iran in the port of Chabahar. And actually, right now, the whole logistics is working. So you have transportation that goes through the whole of China. Then it is transmitted, because we have a different width of rail trains, railroads with China. It is relocated to wheels in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyz. Then it goes to the Caspian Sea, or it goes to the south, and then it ends up in the Indian Ocean. So we have this whole logistics from China to the Indian Ocean, and from China through the Caspian Sea to the Turkey and to the European market without Afghanistan. But it is working. Of course, with Afghanistan we have much more opportunities, but right now China has a big project with a so-called Kashgar corridor, investing about 60 billion USD to to Pakistan, and the Pakistan has its port of Gwadar, which is a very booming project. If we can connect with this Kashgar corridor through Xinjiang, then we have an exit route to the South Asian market, and I think it will be in quite a short future.
Thank you. We have, I think, time for 1 or 2 more questions. One over there, and one over there.
already touched to some extent on the question I have in mind, which is dealing with the degree of coherence. My name is Jonas Rudin, Stockholm University, Stockholm Resilience Center. And the degree of coherence of this block of Central Asian powers. Seeing those with the Nordic countries' coherence or limited coherence eyes, to which degree that type of coherence can be seen also in these central states, especially where in history the emergent possibilities of coherence, as you indicate, and where you are in that process. Of course, there is a diversification to some extent in the superpower type of context, but also in their internal finding their ways, as the Nordic states have done historically over a few centuries.
Thank you. Hand over the microphone, but the mic.
Thank you. Thank you for your insights as well. Actually, I have one question which you already touched or answered partially. Still, I'm quite irritated that you speak about Afghanistan the whole time from the perspective that Central Asian states need Afghanistan. But what is in for Afghanistan in joining such a cooperation? So, as you have developed before, the Central Asian states prioritize on their agenda sovereignty over regionalism for many years. But Afghanistan itself is quite an unstable state, and you can't really speak about a sovereign government. It is highly dependent on foreign actors. So why should Afghanistan be interested in joining a Central Asian cooperation? And there's one more thing. Yeah, first that. No, I got it.
Okay.
And isn't it a disadvantage that you would have one more interest from the Central Asian region to try to fulfill in Afghanistan? Yeah.
I think you answered your own question, actually. You said why should Afghanistan, which is dependent on foreign aid, want to have cooperation with Central Asia? Exactly because it is dependent on outsiders. That's why, what are the alternatives? For Afghanistan, the alternative is, if you want to have cooperation with anybody, is Iran an alternative? Well, Iran is supporting the Taliban, by the way, as the Russians are. Pakistan is the mother of the Taliban. So you look at those major powers are countries that are actively undermining the sovereignty of your country. The only neighboring country, with the possible exception of China, that is not undermining your sovereignty is Central Asia. So that if you look at the map and if you're sitting in Kabul and you have, as you put it, a very weak central government, but it's nevertheless a central government. If you compare Afghanistan to many states, it's one of the weakest central government. If you compare to what you had in 2002, that's a very different story. If you compare, we only see the bad news. But if you look at the statistics of economic statistics, the rise of real Afghan business elites in places like Mazar Sharif that are very real places, that are relatively peaceful. And if you look at the fact that the amount of children that go to school in Afghanistan, it's a completely different country than it was in 2002. So does it have control over the totality of its territory? No. Well, maybe if it even has control over half of its territory, that's something you can deal with, it's something you can work with. So it is there, there is a government. It has all the problems we all know that it does. Who could that government cooperate with? The only answer is Central Asia. I think that's what I would say.
I think that's, I could only totally agree with what was said about Afghanistan. And indeed,
Afghanistan needs Central Asia because much more than Central Asia actually needs Afghanistan right now. Because in the future maybe Afghanistan will become a stable country. It will be like good incentive for us to invest in Afghanistan, to build some kind of infrastructure through Afghanistan to the South Asia. But right now Afghanistan is more dependent on Central Asia as a market, first of all, because they can sell their goods to Uzbekistan, to Tajikistan, agricultural sector. Also, they have some mining sectors, which is also can find the market in Central Asia. Yes, they have a problem of overpopulation to some extent, so they at least can find some place for the migrant workers in Central Asia too. So for Afghanistan, yes, Central Asia is very important, and for now, but mainly for now, Central Asia is becoming a source of some humanitarian aid to Afghanistan, which is very minor actually, and has played actually very little effect in development of Afghanistan as a whole because of the corruption, etc. But yes, in the long term, maybe Afghanistan can become more important for us too, and not now. About the coherence between the Central Asian states, I think that in Central Asia you have this. Why we are so different from, for example, from Afghanistan, actually, it is because of our Soviet legacy. And don't forget about it lasted for almost 80 years. So it was 3 generations of people raised in a totally different atmosphere, totally different culture. Russian-speaking culture, very European, if you Eurocentric in a certain sense, especially if you're talking about the history and how history was presented in schools. We see the world from a Eurocentric perspective, and also a very secular one. So in this regard, yes, Central Asian countries have very much in common with each other, but we are becoming more distant with time because of the cultural differences and because of economical development, which is very much different from country to country. That's why it's so important that Uzbekistan is becoming more open, and we can be engaged with Uzbekistan in a more effective way. So that to create this dynamics of economical cooperation within the region, because without Uzbekistan it can be impossible. All other countries are too small; they're too dependent on external factors, and whether it's labor migration or it's direct humanitarian aid. But Uzbekistan, to an extent, can create this tandem, or of 2 economic drivers. Yeah, so and taking account this cultural heritage of pre-Soviet time, language, history, etc., I think there are good opportunities, as Mr. Svante Cornell said, that according to Bill Harikowski, the ambassador of Singapore, which is actually was just recently in Astana, at Astana Club, so he believed that ASEAN has much less in common, ASEAN countries with each other than Central Asia countries, and indeed it is so. But we do not use this potential, this opportunity to make it, to work for the benefit of the people in the region. But right now, it's becoming more and more possible, I think.
Thank you very much for this dense conversation. There has been a lot of acronyms flying around. I don't think you mentioned AIIB, but we can save that for another session. Thank you very much.